Welcome to the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation. Join us as we uncover the art of giving back.
Hey listeners, there are people who try to be movers and shakers in this world for fame and fortune. Then there are incredible leaders like the dynamic Neil Smith, who works tirelessly to help those who can't help themselves. Get ready to be inspired. Welcome to the podcast, Neil Smith. So, a quick bit about you. International Director of Planet Shakers, CEO of Empower Australia. You're obviously an exceptional leader and you've got an amazing and proven track record of being able to deliver. Before we talk about Empower and Planet Shakers, let's go back. You're originally from Perth, the City of Lights. What was life like for a young Neil Smith?
Well, I loved it. I loved Perth. It's not until you leave that you realise that Perth's a beautiful place, but it's like a big country town. So growing up as a kid, I think it was awesome. I lived in a place called Balcatta, which now I live in Melbourne. It was a highly mixed community, primarily migrants from the 70s, which was all European. And I was the young Australian, but I was in the minority in my suburb. And so that fashioned a lot of fun. I wasn't always a good boy, so we used to have the rivalries and some of the names and stuff that now if you say you could end up in jail for. But the reality was I loved it. And I used to surf a bit and used to play a lot of sport. AFL, hardcore, tragic. But, you know, grew up also in a great home where my dad was in a company called AC Nielsen's, which is a market research company back in the day. And Dad pulled me out of school when I was 16 because I wasn't a great academic, be the understatement.
So back up, what would have been equivalent to about year 10?
Correct, at the end of year 10.
Yep.
And he said, you're good with your hands, let's put you in something. So I did a pre-apprenticeship in carpentry. And at the end of the pre-apprenticeship, which is a year, and cuts a year off your apprenticeship, I got offered 3 opportunities, one in a joiner's shop. And the one I took was with Jennings Construction because it was very multifaceted, could be involved in lots of things, commercial construction as well as development and all sorts of things. From then on, life in an academic sense changed because they put me through college basically to do my builder's studies and ended up in project management when I was 21. But at the same time I attended a local church youth group of about 25 kids. And that's probably where I developed this building industry or commercial side of life and people. And to be honest, by the time I was 23, I loved the people, even though I was earning a ridiculous amount of money. And I jumped off that bike and went into the sort of running youth groups, and that ended up where I am today, really.
So cheeky, a bit naughty at times.
Not anymore, of course.
Were you a leader throughout school? Were you a natural born leader?
Look, you know, it's not something I like to talk about myself in that sense, but yes, my mum would always say, didn't matter what you did, you always became the leader.
Yeah.
Which when I was on the wrong side of the ledger, that wasn't a good thing. I've somehow managed to get on the right side of the ledger now. So.
And I was about to say, your life is hugely centralised now around faith, and one of my questions was going to be, was that through your upbringing with your family, or did you find faith at a later point in life? When did all that happen for you?
Yeah, look, I think in essence, my grandparents were coal miners in England. My parents migrated in 71, and so I was born in England, but I came out in 71. So I was only a year old. But my grandparents were coal miners in a very tough time in English history. And they discovered the church, but discovered the God factor back then. And that really reshaped our whole family, went from a working class poverty mentality type family to becoming more middle class and more moderate in the way they did life. So faith was paralleled with that connection. That sounds great, but when you're a kid, when you're told you got to go to church, and back in those days, you know, had to dress up and all the rest of it. It wasn't until I was 16 on a camp that I really made my own decision that, yeah, this is something I want to do. Probably for the 16 years before that, I did everything to get out of that because there was stigma attached with that back then as well, you know, going off to church as a kid and, you know, dressed up, tell my friends I was going to see my grandma every Sunday for many years, and they could accept me dressing up to go and see my grandma, but, you know, going to church might have been. And that might have been in my head more than in their head, but as a kid. So, yeah, so that fashioned me to realise that church was less about showing up to church and all the rhetoric of church, and probably Francis of Assisi makes a statement that if you're going to let people know of God, it's probably less about words and more about action, and that's probably shaped where I am today because of those years.
Yeah, so around 16, I mean, you had faith in your life before that, but that was the time that you chose to embrace it or more heavily invest into it. Was there a light bulb moment, or it was just sort of around that age?
I broke my arm on a thing called an earth ball. If you're old enough, you can remember an earth ball. They're legal now, but it was something that was as high as the ceiling, and you'd kick them around an oval or whatever. It's just a blow-up ball, and I was on the top of it. You could sort of slide up, being the renegade I was, and sat on the top, and somebody came underneath, fell, broke my arm. Went to hospital. It was on a youth camp. And there was a speaker the night I got back from the hospital. I was in bad state, broken arm, drugged up. And he just said, in essence, is your life going to matter? That's all I can remember from what he said. I don't even know if he did say that. I had a few drugs, so it could have been anything he was saying, but that's what I remember. And at that moment, I realised, wow, which is quite an epiphany, I guess, for a 16-year-old, but I just thought, and it was probably the multiple effect of my dad, who's a hero, he's passed away now, who always never made me do something. He wanted me to be positioned to who I could become rather than feeling this sense of I've got to study, I've got to get a degree, he always just said, do something that's worthwhile with your life. So those two things probably converged at that moment. And I just made a decision that weekend. It was an Easter weekend years and years and years ago in 1986. I asked if I could get involved in leadership in the youth group. Before I had my licence, actually, I was leading a youth group of about 30 kids. And the rest is history, really grew to 100 kids. And it just, at the time of doing my apprenticeship and working for the company, I'd speak at these events, and then I'd get invited to speak at other camps and other events. And my group continued to grow. The truth is my business opportunities continued to grow. Everything sort of grew. And I would put that in no small part to my centeredness in faith, because it gave me that sense of purpose. I'm not just waking up doing a job. I'm not just running a youth group. I'm actually contributing beyond myself, I guess. Still on that crazy journey, still not sure what I'm doing, but enjoying the ride.
We're going to get to what you're doing now. So 16, you've dropped out of school. You haven't dropped out of school. You've left school to take up a carpentry apprenticeship. You've found faith and obviously shaped the majority of what you're doing now. Was there a corporate Neil Smith in the private sector before we get to Planet Shakers?
Yeah, look, the challenge I had probably... So I was in Jennings Construction, which became Fletcher Construction in Australia. And when I was, 18, I actually used to play basketball. I was a reasonable basketball player, and I did an ankle injury. I've got incredibly flat feet, and I did an ankle injury, and it meant that I couldn't walk almost for 6 months. And I ended up in the office rather than on the tools. And I did so well, I started working for my construction manager directly. And that's when they decided to put me through what they called in those days a construction cadetship. So before I finished my apprenticeship, most people at Jennings got laid off. I actually got offered, and it was in this season where I couldn't work on the tools anyway. So I got my trade, and then I'm working in the tools. And everything I touched in that world just opened up for me. I got offered quite a serious position in project management. Back then it was probably, but you're talking in the late 80s, I was offered like close to $100,000.
That was at Fletcher's?
Yeah, as a 20-year-old boy who had no clue what I was doing. That's probably not terrible money now, but back then that was a fortune. They in fact offered me to go overseas to run a contract after that. And then when I decided, the church approached me and said, would you work for us 3 days a week? If you know anything about churches, that means, will you work for us 7 days a week, but we'll pay you 3 days. And even what we pay you is lousy anyway. And of course, the cause was pumping in my veins, so I said yes. It was funny because I went and asked my dad's advice. The only time he's ever said anything nasty to me, and he said, are you an idiot? Take the money, don't take the youth group thing. But he meant it in the context of, you've still got a lot of life to live, you don't need to do this. So I jumped off and I went from potential of 100,000 down to 12,000 a week. But that probably taught me a lot, that money isn't everything, and if you focus, it comes to you rather than, I live a great life. I've got no challenges when it comes to finances, but I've never earned what I could have earned. But then if you earn in that environment, you spend in that environment as well, whereas in the environments I've been in, the focus hasn't been so much on some of the other stuff that comes with being in a high-profile position. So no regrets in that regard. I got married young too. So the tradition of faith-based communities back then was don't sleep around, so get married young. It was almost a parent push. So we were going out, she was 13, I was 14. We got married when we were 19.
How many kids?
So we got 2 kids now. We didn't have kids for 7 years, but she was second year in university when all those decisions. So part of my dad's idiot statement was, look after your wife, don't go and she finished a university. We were on no money.
She married the guy that was about to get $100,000 a year and ended up with the dude on $12,000 a year.
Exactly. But she was as committed to the cause, I guess, as I was. So, and she had parents that were very much get the degree. So she's a speech pathologist by profession. She worked in, and in fact, great news is that 2 years later, she basically within a year became the district head of the government for disability services and had a car and money and phone. It was a brick back in those days, but it was still a phone.
So she was on big money and you were working 7 days getting paid for 3.
Exactly. I did actually work 2 days a week. People who were building their own home, they had to have somebody license it back in those days, and that's how I supplemented income. I would go in and watch over the house over the 6 months they build and then sign off on the license with my capacity that I had in building back then.
2 kids seems easy. That sounds really easy.
It's fantastic.
I've got my own faith-based community.
Exactly. Basketball team.
I've got 4 kids.
Yeah, no, and they didn't come till quite a bit later. 27. So they've been fantastic. I mean, we got a boy and a girl, and as you know, that's the important part of your life, really.
So you've taken the new job with the church, and I'm assuming back then, I mean, that wasn't Planet Shakers.
No, it's a little sort of on the corner church.
Yeah. What did you do there?
I was actually the youth leader, I guess they would call it in those days, and that was like jack of all trades. There was probably church of 250 people, and there was maybe 2.5 staff. So you just did whatever was required to get the job done. But I was primarily the youth leader. But when I was brought on staff, I'd grown it from sort of 20 to 50, 60 kids, and then on staff grew it to over 100, which now, like the youth group we have here at Planet Shakers, 800 to 1,000 kids on a Friday night. 100 was like revolutionary back in those days. But then the church was also smaller. A big church was 300-400 people in those days. So to have a youth group of 25% of the church, I guess, was big. Well, looking back now, I'd never thought of it at the time. I just thought there's a lot of people and let's get as many as we can to the program. So,
and did it work well?
In its time, it worked well, yeah. I don't think that youth ministry looking after young people's changed. And our objective, my whole thing is make memories for people. It's the same with my own kids. You can't control a lot, but you can control what your memories are. And if you can have the pot of memories that's full of good rather than bad, then that's your life. And so my job in youth work was to make memories and try and make them good. So we had a lot of fun. Back in those days, you could fill a car, and I had the smallest car on the block, but you could get 10, 15 kids in the car and pick them all up from all over town. And that was as much fun as going to youth group, just the interaction. And, loving on kids in the right sense. We hear all the negative stuff now that's happened through churches and faith-based communities and government and everything, really. But kids just need to know that somebody actually cares about them. So heading to McDonald's or getting on the phone and how'd you go with that exam today? That's how we really built it, just loving people. And then I learnt the art of replicating yourself so that I'm only looking after 5-6 kids really, and there's 10 other people looking after 5 or 6 kids, and that's how you grow the youth group. Well, not rocket science, but less of yourself and more of other people, I guess.
So you've gone from a corner church with 80 kids, and I certainly want to talk about Planet Shakers. I mean, that you mentioned 800 to 1,000 kids on a Friday night. This is a serious operation now. Was there anything between the church that you had that was on the corner to Planet Shakers before we get to Planet Shakers?
Sure.
Is there anything else that...
Yeah, so we started a church when we were 27, Leonie and I. We figured we'd seen different models of different things. And I always had a propensity to community sort of action stuff. So I wanted to explore that. So we started a church called Lakes Christian Life Centre, which has now gone on to be a church called Kingdom City, which is in multiple locations all around the world. Mark was my associate who runs that now. But basically, we just wanted to be a local community presencing church that, if you like, enriched people's lives. Faith is something that is very intentionally personal, and that's the key thing for people to understand is that faith isn't a collective, it's what you believe as an individual. So you've got to create an environment that's conducive for people to say, I want faith or I don't. But ultimately, it's their choice. And as soon as we start to impose their choice, then we become a cult or we become But a great thing about a church community, it should be the hub of the community. It should actually help people, whether they got need in their marriage, they got need in their kids, they are a kid, they've got need for food, whatever it is. We should actually, and traditionally, a church, if you like, in Middle England, Europe, which we would have an identity of a steeple, and even in a building sense, that was built first because it became the centre of a community. And so in a building sense, the spire was never a religious thing. It was a statement of, we can all see the spire from where we live. That's the centre of our community. And that's where births and deaths and marriages and bingo, and we just as a church have to keep adapting that. And so for us, we wanted to create a community church, and I called it Lakes. No religious connotation, no spiritual connotation. We called it Lakes because lakes to me sounded like a property development, and I wanted it to be a place where people felt like, oh, you can go there and it's a nice place. We had a cafe, if you remember Gloria Jeans. We were the first contractor Gloria Jeans in a foyer of a church, and I wanted that whole sense of hub where people come and there's action and there's community. We went to Lotteries Commission in West Australia. Lotteries Commission is set up where all donations in West Australia go to the local community. So we set ourselves up and we built a beautiful kids program that on Sundays was used for church, but during the week it was an open facility when people could come to the cafe, use the facility. And so we did a lot of things wrong, but we learnt a lot, and that was in sort of the northern suburbs of Perth, which Perth is, unlike Melbourne, Perth lives to recreate. So they go to work out how they can buy their boat or how they can, whereas Melbourne goes on holidays once or twice a year, but primarily everything's centric around work, whereas Perth, probably because of the weather, and that had challenges running a church, because if it's a fine weekend, everybody disappears for the weekend, so you're trying to get people to come, but they're all leaving. So we built that church and bought a property, and that grew to about 1,800 people. And it was sort of the fastest growing thing in West Australia at the time, and learnt a lot. Didn't know what we were doing still. Still don't. That's our whole life, but enjoyed the ride, really.
It's like talking to me. Love what I do it well, but I don't really know what I'm doing.
Exactly. And then we did this whole thing with foster care, and that's where I met Tim Costello, actually. Him and I ended up speaking at a government function in West Australia. He was the guest speaker and I was the local guest speaker. And we met each other in a green room after we'd done our sessions. Basically, I had the adage that every kid doesn't get a choice of the life they have. So imagine if we could position a kid so they got the most benefits they possibly could. And what we used to do with foster care is encourage people to foster care, respite care. But then the carers that were in place were getting a lot of flack because were they professional carers? Did they care about the kids? So what we did is we got our business community to raise money, and we'd have a Christmas function. And I used to love them, and I'd dress up for Father Christmas because I just loved it. I used to have a car that used to have an open sunroof, and I'd drive in with the Santa hat on. I love that as much as all the organisation. And we'd have 300 kids come in, and we'd have probably 600 carers, and we'd put on Christmas dinner for all the carers, and we'd go to all the local communities and they'd get prizes and spot prizes. In that foster care world, most people who were even involved back then were lower socioeconomic, so to have anything like that was incredible. But at the same time, we'd get our kids program to have bouncing castles and games and competitions, and every kid would get a gift from Santa, and I just loved giving the gifts to kids. I still do it. I sit in the city and I just imagine what's going on in people's lives. And some of it's good, some of it's not good. But I like to, stay real to, I live in a certain world. Is everybody in that world? And keep asking myself that question. So being Santa, given a kid, and you see kids just go nuts. I don't know. I just love that because my kids live in a good environment. Well, I think they did. You have to ask them, I guess. I thought it was good. But a lot of kids, you hear the struggle and anything we can do to relieve the struggle is still important to me because they don't get to choose. And so you hear these horror stories of foster kids. And one of the best things we ever did was got the business community to book a cinema. It was good and bad. This is what I mean by I don't know what I'm doing. I thought my favourite movie growing up as a kid was the Oompa Loompa, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And the new version was coming out. And so I was pumped about it, Johnny Depp. So we got bags of chocolate and golden tickets in it, and we had PlayStations to give away for the kid who had the golden ticket and all that. But then, of course, if you actually watched Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the second one, it was all about Johnny Depp had a real bad father issues. And so I've got all these foster kids in the room. The whole movie's about father issues. And I turned to the head of government and go, this is the wrong movie. And she just started laughing. She thought it was hilarious. But it was amazing. 80% of those kids had never been to a movie. And we didn't do it for that, but that just broke my heart. I mean, a movie, such a basic thing. And these are kids in Australia. And I guess more and more I realised that there are two economies always operating, and because we're very middle to upper class in Australia, we forget that there's still a massive portion of population.
And that lower class is now growing at a rate that we've never seen before. Strange as the lower class continues to grow at such a rapid rate, so does the high class. Like, we're really sort of starting to lack that middle class in Australia now. There's a lot of people with a lot of money, but gee, there's a lot of people doing it really, really tough.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of third world, which I work in, the third world developments, it's actually intentionally set up that way because the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it's about controls, really. Australia's enjoyed since the 70s a very middle class environment, but you're right, it's shifting.
It's shifting now.
And we just got to be careful that the powers to be don't actually start to enjoy that. They have more than the average bear.
So 27, you've started up the Lakes Christian Faith Centre. Mark still runs that. You don't. You're in Melbourne. What happened next?
Look, I got to about 35. I was the leader of a movement of churches. They asked me to come in on board. Funnily thing is, I didn't have a credential or a minister's credential because I went from business into it. And they came to me and said, would you lead? And I said, yeah, there's only one problem. I don't really have a credential. And they were all shocked at that because I was sort of part of this collective of churches. So they sort of fast-tracked me into the credential and then asked me to lead it after 2.5 years. So most people leading those sort of denominations and movements were, for my state, it was about 80 churches, were sort of in their 50s, and here I am at 35. And in my background of family, that's almost the epitome. To run a movement, you're the leader of a church, you've made it.
And is that when you became a pastor? Around that age?
Yeah, 28 is when I became an official bona fide pastor. I think I was doing everything you're supposed to do, but
you just didn't have the title.
It's like now I've got titles, but half of them I don't know what they mean. I just get the job done, basically. So I ran that movement and was very dissatisfied. I thought I was having a leadership role, but I was actually like a management role. And I was just managing everybody else's rubbish, to be honest with you. All these churches that were struggling, I had nothing to do with them, but suddenly when they fell over, it was in the news and I'm having to deal with it and I had nothing to do with it. And I was like, I didn't sign up for managing other people's mess. And that probably took me on a journey of, what am I doing? Is running a church my fulfillment? Is running a movement? This is the epitome. I'm 35. Can I do this for the next 30 years? Not a chance. I couldn't. So it took me about 18 months, 2 years, because I probably also thought, if you're not the head of something, you're not valid. That was an insecurity issue, but the senior pastor of a church in the world I was traversing was the top of the tree. So if I just became a member of a team, who's even going to notice me? So I had to really work through that, and 18 months, 2 years, probably, my parents being proud of me, all that stuff I had to work through. Russell started a conference called Planet Shakers in Adelaide, and he started that probably 10 years earlier. And I went to the first conference as a youth leader in Adelaide in South Australia. I loved it, and so I just said to him, listen, anything I can do to help you. And we were buddies anyway. He'd speak at my youth events and I'd speak. That's where me and Russell, who's the founder of Planet Shakers, met. We were asked to run Youth Alive, which was the interdenominational youth events, and we were getting 50,000 people around Australia to big events with pooling all youth groups you talk about, working together with other groups. We had Anglicans and Catholic and Uniting and Independents, and all we do is focus on this faith message, and we'd go into schools and we'd take bands and say, come to a night, and we'd present it to the kids. Again, making it up as we went along, really. But what we learnt in that phase is we needed to work with other groups. We needed to be connected. And I also learnt that I was from the Pentecostal persuasion, but growing up, some of the other persuasions were like, were they even Christian? But when we work together, you realise 85% of what we all are talking about is the same. Let's focus on that rather than the 15% we don't agree with. So that drew me and Russell. He started a conference in his own youth group, and 300 the first conference. Well, that grew to 30,000 in 5 years all around Australia. Big venues. It just blew up.
But still based out of Adelaide.
Still based out of Adelaide. So what happened was, like everything else, I went on, we started an official organisation, and I became the international director, the vice president, whatever you want to call it, of the organisation. But we got 300 people once a year, so it wasn't much of an organisation. Well, here I am as the international director, 24 years later, and now we actually do have a few things we got to do around the place. But that's where it began, and so that's where our relationship. So he then starts here in Melbourne, and I'm on the board, and this thing goes to 800 in the first service, and then it just starts blowing up to 4,000 before we know it. And I'm here once a month, and I'm the leader of a movement, and I've got a church. And I'm like, is this what my life's about? And it just came to the point where better doing what I'm purposed to do than just being the headship of something.
What is Planet Shakers today?
In what regard?
As an entity, as an organisation. I mean, it's a big organisation, and I want to draw from what you're about to tell me into what you now do with Empower. But
Sure.
Before we get to Empower, now it's gone from Adelaide, it's gone from 300 to 800. It's a serious operation now. What is Planet Shakers today?
Well, Planet Shakers in Australia is just under 20,000 people attend. So over a weekend, probably about 13 to 14,000 attend. And there's probably 30 to 40% that would attend as a minimum once a month in various locations. We've got 5 locations in Melbourne, but the main location is still here in South Melbourne. So there's Planet Shakers Church, and then there's Planet Shakers Ministry. We started as Planet Shakers Ministry, which is a band. So if you look online, we've got about 7 million followers across social media platforms. In the top 10 Christian bands globally. So to give you context, if you just put the Christian music genre in North America in place, it's bigger than the whole music industry in Australia, if you put every other genre of music together in Australia. So we've been in the top 10 artists in North America for 20 years. And so we tour probably 25 weeks a year, the band. We have sort of 30 make up the band, which they all have to be represented in a local church setting, still to this day, so that we don't get prima donnas and touring band members who are gods unto themselves, that they recognise we're still going and we're giving to what we do. It's just on a global scale.
You put your hand up at any stage to go on tour?
No. Well, look, I'm sort of default manager of the band, have been for years, and the music and the business deals, and just trying to keep that so that it doesn't become an industry in our own world, because that has all sorts of pulls, and there's as much about stardom in the Christian world as there is in other, and so trying to keep everybody involved, remembering we're a local church that wants to reach people. And we've got this, with privilege comes responsibility. We've got privilege in what we do around the world, so let's make sure we're responsible for what we've been given. So so there's the ministry, which also includes a college. We have about an officially approved college, Crikos, which is the ability to have international students part of what we do, which is quite a process. We have a group of academic people that are here on site. We have around about 300 students that are enrolled either year for first year, second year or third year in a bachelor's program in leadership. Then we have, like I said, our music business. So we have recording studios. I don't know if you've seen them here, but full recording studios. And then we have our international division, which is called Believe, which is our foundation of what we run in the South Pacific. And then, of course, we have Empower, which is really straddles between the two. It's actually its own legal entity. And Empower is designed really to be the community arm of what we do.
That's what I want to talk to you about today. So I was about to say, there's Neil Smith, International Director of Planet Shakers, and Planet Shakers is a great thing, but I'm here to learn more about Empower, and I guess Neil Smith is CEO of Empower Australia and the amazing work it does. You touched on it briefly then. What's Empower?
So look, Empower has been going for 13 years, so I don't want to take any credit for Empower. It's the team who have been running it, some that are still with us and some that started out. But it was running primarily as a program that we go into the local flats, housing development areas, helping people in the area of food insecurity. And I sit on the board that's over all of these things. And in all honesty, there was a few people involved that were supposed to raise money to help it grow. I'm a patient man, but after a couple of years of continuing seeing this thing flag on the board report, I was like, well, why aren't we actually doing something? We keep talking about it. And I'm a Christian, so I was probably anything but Christian in my attitude on that particular day about this particular issue. and I probably said a few things that I shouldn't have said, and then suddenly my Christianity kicked in, and I thought, I shouldn't be like that for the rest of the board meeting. So at the end, I just said, I've got an ability in the area of probably being able to raise some funds. Why don't I come in for 1 year And I said that to the chairman of the board, and he said, oh, that's a great idea, let's go with it. But if you know anything about volunteer and church-based organisations, don't ever say anything for 1 year, because here I am 7 years later still involved. But I put my hand up, and when I left Perth, there was a couple of things, but one of the key things was to really pastor come alongside the business community. Because the business community is an incredible community of people, but generally they're very focused people, and they make a lot of money or they buy influence, but they lose everything else so often. They lose their family. And so I felt like I wanted to get involved, and by default I was always meeting all these people that were in this area. So I wanted to pastor, be a friend to these sort of people. So I had this sort of latent resource of people. So I just put on a charitable dinner, and we raised 150 grand in sort of 2 months later. But then the problem was I wasn't directly involved in the organisation, and I'm like, okay, I got 150 grand. What the heck do I do with this? So got the team around me, said, what do you do? And some of the Mercy people would have given everybody $1 each, and we would have hit all these people that had nothing left. Other people didn't want to spend it at all. It's not that much money. So for probably 4 months, I did nothing. I just listened to people. In February, this would be my faith connection, I had this thought, expand the food relief centres, expand. And at that stage, we only had one. So I went to our team, said, if we expanded to 3, 4, 5 locations, what could we do? How much would it cost? And some locations where church was operating were cinemas, so we didn't have facilities. Others, we had some facilities. So we came up with this pop-up concept, and mid-February, we decided we were going to launch it. So we spent about 90 grand and did it up. And of course, that was February 2020, and the government declared we're closed down. So the day that I launched it, the day that we didn't know what we could do, we'd spent all this money and we couldn't do anything. But you might not know this, but 2 days later, the government declared the only use of church-based facilities is for food bank. And it was written into the law of COVID, which was awesome because we had 120 plus staff, college students, and they weren't allowed to leave home. But with a licence that I could sign, they could come and work in our food relief centre. So we suddenly had purpose in the middle of COVID, and that's where our volunteer army, you'll remember, exploded. In fact, I had nearly 2,000 people that wanted to come because they just wanted to get out of home. I don't think they were really that philanthropic. And so we went from feeding 150 people a week to over 3,000 in about 9 or 10 weeks.
How'd you keep up with that from a logistics perspective?
No idea. Look, every week we'd meet, and the good thing was because the church had accounts, logistics division, and they couldn't do anything for church, I could draw on all those people resources to work out how we do it. Our IT department, we created computer programs, check-in systems. They could show up at everything, and so fortuitously that just grew our skill base massively. And then we supplemented that with more volunteers, and there was already a team of people. And it was hard because I was trying to manage these faithful people that have been building this thing for 10 years, but suddenly we've gone from this tiny little organisation that was in the back corner to massive profile. And then about halfway through the process, Channel 9 got a sniff of it. And the reason they got a sniff of it, because the property we're sitting in now, if you walked around it, it's nearly a kilometre. And we had lines going right around the whole building, socially distanced and all that sort of stuff, crosses on the footpath. It was a nightmare. But a lot of people thought we were running church. So we were getting abuse from people driving past. What are you running church for in this season? And where the charity is a long way from where the church is, but people just made the assumption because there was people around. But that sort of raised profile. So, out of every negative, there's a positive. And that raised profile. People were asking questions. Police were coming 6 or 7 times a day. But they were fine. But they have to, if they get a complaint, show up. And so they'd show up and we'd give them a coffee and say thanks for coming. And it built good relationship with them. We got known by the community. Channel 9 shows up. And at the start, a lot of it was international students who couldn't go home but couldn't get any money from the government. And they were desperate. And so 50% of our clientele quickly became international students back then. Probably changed a little now. And honestly, we just have 2 days talking how we're going to do this, what are we going to do, how we're going to pack shelves. We had to go from one location that really comfortably took those few hundred people to 3 locations, educating the team. We were learning social distancing, keeping hands clean. We had a massive venue, but we had to have them outside because you weren't allowed to have more than 100 people inside, which was a tragedy because it was raining and cold, and we've got this massive facility, but that was life. And yeah, we just sort of made it up as we went along. And so we discovered the largest face-to-face food charity in Australia within 10 weeks. And we still are. And that put us on the map with Second Bite, which is sort of Coles provider, Oz Harvest, which is Woolworths provider, Food Bank, and a number of others, and we just started to make partnerships. One of the great partnerships happened in that season was a guy drives past in a convertible and starts yelling out the window, "What are you doing here?" And we thought he was abusing. But actually he wasn't. He was a management guy from McCain's. And within a week or two, they brought all the McCain's sort of senior team back. And McCain's gave us about $1.8 million worth of produce during the next 12 months because they just loved the concept and what was happening. And that's sort of how it happened. I can't tell you, it wasn't our genius that we worked it all out, but we did go from half a tonne to 30 tonne of food a week. So suddenly we had a logistics nightmare. We had no forklifts. We had no storage. So we were literally filling up the shelves. Almost come to the end of the week with like a few things left on the shelf, then have to get more stuff on the shelf next week. Whereas now we've built sort of backlog so that we've learnt as we've gone along, and so we've actually got storage.
You mentioned Second Bite, Oz Harvest, things like that. Is that where you get all of your products from, or have you got independent suppliers that you got relationships with that back you into?
We have, so primarily no, we get it primarily from Food Bank. Oz Harvest drops some off. Second Bite has, in fact Second Bite gave us a 40-foot reefer, which is a refrigerator freezer in that time, but Second Bite not so much anymore. And then various others that give us different levels of food. But no, we still constantly working it out. During COVID, we ended up sort of pushing the government on a few things, and we got about $80,000 worth of sponsorship from the government, and we bought food, but we bought it at a cost price. But no, South Melbourne markets we're trying to work with. We're trying to work with local grocers that will give us bread and different things that goes to waste. We're still making it up, to be honest. It's not set, and it changes all the time. And as you know, right now, there's a massive food security issue again, and so your suppliers are changing all the time. You just have to be pretty robust and keep changing what we do. But now we've got trucks, and we don't have trucks. We have a van, one van, but we have connections to all these organisations that will truck and drop stuff off here. We have a forklift now, and we're talking about getting a second. We've got shelving units all the way through. But in the middle, I was saying Channel 9 showed up, and always nervous about media because media's good and bad, but actually did a great story, and that just projected us. Probably 200,000 of philanthropic giving came in a 2-week space. People saw it on the news. We're all sitting at home with nothing to do. It probably gave everybody some purpose, and that just helped us to be able to get shelving and think a bit more purposefully about how do we not just live week to week, because food for us was less about the food and more about a point of connection, which we learned a lot about in COVID, that isolation was bad. And so there's a point of connection with people in their lives. And so we didn't want them to stay on insecurity for the rest of their life. But we then had to think about human dignity. A lot of people that were coming to get food during COVID were middle-class people like me who could never think of going to a food bank to get food. So we had to position it in such a way, and I think you've seen our facilities, but we sort of designed them around Whole Foods, if you've ever been to America, which is quite an upmarket supermarket. And I figured I don't want to build something that looks like a crappy go and get your food and it's second-hand food and all the rest of it. If I was going, I'd want to feel like, so when you walk around our supermarket, you feel like you're in a supermarket. You feel like you choose our food. You don't get a bag of food given to you, and the reason for that, your human dignity. I want to choose what I want to eat, not be told this is what you've got this week. And then what we added was we added 10 products like pasta and rice, and because again, this was my thinking. When you go to the shops, you have your staple things that you know you're going to get. Well, most food banks get whatever they can get, so we started to buy products, and so we have 6 to 8 weeks of pasta and rice and pasta sauce so that people know every week they're going to get that. And so through our volunteer army, a lot of people in COVID, I'm talking everybody, wanted to give us food, so we tell them what to buy, so that, and milk as well, we get UHT milk so that it lasts a bit better, so that they felt purposeful in giving. But whereas most organisations come from the aspect of give us whatever you can, we started to say, no, this is about people's lives. This is what we want you to give. And we found in Australia, people love that. They get it.
So you went from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand. What does it look like now post-COVID?
Well, it was to 3,000. Now it's averaging about 1,700.
Is that just here, or is that across your other locations?
Across the other locations, but about 80% of it's here. because the other locations are a lot smaller, always have been. Geelong increased over COVID because a lot of the other charities in Geelong shut down because most of their volunteers were 50 plus, which were the most at-risk people. But now that's settled back again because some of those places have opened, whereas here by far is our biggest.
1,700 is still a lot of people.
Yeah.
It goes to show that it wasn't, as much as COVID might have exacerbated the problem, it wasn't a COVID problem. There's a real issue in Melbourne now with children and families living under the poverty line that do have issues with food, access to education, access to health. There's a huge problem out there.
Yeah, and I think a couple of problems. I think the problem is food is... Go back a step, and it's language is a big issue. I don't think we're bringing a lot of people in on the basis of either education or coming in because we've got certain industries that we need to service. But the problem is, for example, we had about 80 Ukrainian women and their children come in. The government brought them in, gave them a month. And most of them are educated, but they're educated and they speak Russian, Ukrainian. They can't get a job because they don't speak the language. So they can't go and earn money, and some of them have some money, but they can't eat into those reserves forever, so they'd come to us, and it was a tough road for them to come because there's a big pride factor of showing up, but once we made it very available to them. And so we also now run an entry to English course with a number of teachers that give their time. We actually have supplementary things like there's a lady who we partner with who has clothes that you can wear to an interview. We had PricewaterhouseCoopers wanted to do a social development day, so they came in and rather than put them in the food bank, we got them to write up a job ready program so that people could actually come. Because as I said, food is the point of connection, but it shouldn't be the end game, or otherwise we're just going to be feeding people. And there's a percentage of people that will always need that. But if anybody's listening, we shouldn't think in Australia that we don't have a problem. There is a large percentage of the population that can't afford to go and buy food. So we've got to create a pathway that takes them out of that place of need to be reintegrated back. And most people, the good thing is they want that. But I think there's a stigma around if you go to a food, you're just you're not looking after yourself. You got a drug problem. Get a job. And that's a really bad outlook because majority, and I'm talking 90%, aren't in that frame. The 10% will always be with us. We should just look after them because we should look after them. Rights and wrongs in it all, but we choose, unlike a lot of food-based charities, that we don't ask you for your social security or are you any of those things to be eligible, because yes, there'll be a percentage of people that will abuse the privilege, but that'll be a low percentage. But we don't want to put the people who really need it off because they've got to expose all these things about who they are and their weakness at this moment. So for us, that's important.
So apart from being a face-to-face food bank, what else does Empower do?
So Empower we've run these school programs for years. It started out with some knifings in the West probably 12 years ago, and a principal rang us and said, can you help us? And we didn't want it to be perceived to be a religious program because instantly you're marginalising different people. But nevertheless, when you're talking to people about behavioural patterns, so we called it No Bull, and No Bull is a program that now runs on average about 30 schools a month. We have all sorts of programs. We tailor them, to be honest. So again, we don't say this is what we do. We say here's some of the things we do, but we can add whatever. So different principals wanted to do leadership training, wanted us to do No Bull, the bullying system. Because we've got a large youth group in the church, instantly we've got this whole flock of people. We had a massive import of students from various African nations come in as migrants, and that's a massive issue in our city. But many of them have got locked into the youth program and now they become leaders. So the St Kilda Football Club have asked us to go with them, and Nathan Love at Murray and some of the guys created a program called Sticks and Stones, which is anti-racism program. And because we got a lot of kids that are from various backgrounds, they're involved in the upfront presentation with the football club of those sort of programs. So really, again, that's just meeting the point of need. Our approach has probably always been, what is the need? How can we help you with it? Rather than this is what we do, this is what we want to impose on you. And we learnt that when we were in high schools when I was a lot younger. You go to a principal and say, what can we do to help? And they say, why are you here? And well, because we want to help. And that was always sort of met with, you must have another motive. And the reality is that opens all sorts of doors for you. You end up soccer coaching, or you end up speaking to an at-risk group of kids, or help something with the teachers as trust is built. opportunities open up, and that's just how we've always done it. So no bull in the flats-based program. We do a lot of stuff on Saturdays where our outreach teams go out into the flats. We're just about to launch another one here in South Melbourne. And really, we just set up, that's like going to Bunnings, you smell the snags burning, you get that sense of community. We have programs, we have the food if they want it, we'll have bags of food with us. And it's just, again, about connecting. A lot of those people in the flats are disconnected and isolated, scared of each other. There's drugs, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And so we've just found a lot of people come who over weeks come and tell us, oh, we never leave our apartment, we never do this. So that's the outreach program. And then we're looking at how can we take food beyond coming and getting a bag of food. So we're looking to pioneer a program where we take the barbecue into schools on the back of a trailer. We're building trailers at the moment with barbecues on the back. And we go in, because one of the big food security issues relating to education is a lot of kids go to school without breakfast. And so get the butchers and the local grocers in areas give us food that day, barbecue before they have school, work with the principals, and just hit it in a different direction.
Are you getting traction with that?
You got every man his dog want us to do it. We just got to gear up to do it because we've only got a small team, small staff. We've got a lot of volunteers, just getting some of the fundamental things in place.
We spoke earlier about the second bite, Oz Harvest and things like that, but there's so much more that goes into running something like this, and you're talking about building trailers and going in and doing barbecues and all these other things that you do. It costs a lot of money. Are you working here predominantly on philanthropic donors, or have you got a social enterprise side to the business that generates an income? How does Empower get the financial resources that are required to do so much?
It's a good question. Look, my whole life we've worked on the principle, probably in a secular society sense, build the shopping centre and they will come. If you meet the need, it's amazing how people come out of the woodwork. If I was to put it in a viable how it works sense, I probably don't have a simple answer for you. But there's simplicity in if you do something well, it manages to resource itself, whether that's in business or in philanthropic or otherwise. Now, you're here interviewing me and no idea how all the threads come together, but they do. And I could tell you that the Channel 9 story showing up at that time funded us through a time where how we're going to do that. But on top of that, then there's various organisations that we do work with, and they do various drives at different times. It's been the National Bank, or it's been Price Waterhouse have given us 10 grand out of their fund, or this person has done it. The church community that we're in, obviously, we as a church community underwrite all the salaries of the people. So as much as we've got 3 or 4, my salary's not even included in those conversations, but the church really underwrites all of that. We don't charge the entity anything for that. So that's how we make that happen. But we don't then go, well, let's get another 10 people involved. We try to do it through volunteerism, and if you can take away the salary component, then costs are drastically diminished. But buying stuff, I could tell you story after story how somebody put in for this and somebody put in for that. This organisation came to us, we just bought a new van. I joke, because as a church pastor, if we gave a pastor a Mercedes, that'd be all over the news. But our philanthropic charity, our main guy, Chris, he drives a Mercedes, but it is a van. And he does pick up fruit and vegetables in it, but I tell him, you're driving a Mercedes, mate, and that's paid for by the organisation. But that was a government grant that somebody told us about, and we applied, and it was very unencumbered, and it came through. And we've been told you can't get vans. So I could tell you story after story after story, but then the church community would give towards various philanthropic things, like during COVID we gave away 100 grand. That came from the church community. We gave away 260,000 to the hospital appeal last Easter. Instead of what we take on a Sunday, we made a decision that we were going to give that. And most of that we do through the charity. We give it to the charity and then the charity gives it out. And so there'd be anywhere between 150 and 300,000 that comes from that community as well towards funding that and financing that. And then the church organisation pays all the rent. But the good news is, on the site we're on, I approached these guys and they ultimately want to build towers on these sites, but COVID and all sorts of other things have stopped that happening. So because we're a bona fide charity operating in their premises, that part of the premises can get full tax deductibility. So they give us the site almost for nothing because they get their tax deduction back. So in essence, it costs them a lot less to have us in there than it would if it was a normal paying organisation. But that was really me going and brokering a deal with them and helping them to understand. And then they're like, yeah, it's a great idea, let's do that. So it's just a variety of means. I'm not trying to not tell you how it works. I don't actually know how it works.
It works.
And the more it's like a lot of things I've done in life, the more you try to drill down how it works, the more you realise it doesn't. So stay away from that and just keep trusting it's going to happen.
We've talked about the programs that you're in within the community, helping refugees. We've talked about helping kids. We've talked about feeding kids. How important is education?
Look, education leads directly to capacity. And if you don't have capacity, you can't lift yourself out of something. So one of the things we've got to be careful of is that we don't say, these people aren't helping themselves. It's hard to help yourself if you don't have capacity. So education is critical. And I think in a world in which we live where education is getting potentially less accessible as much as we've got lots of it, and if you then come up in a family setting where there's no push for that, because you've got generations of it's the odd person breaks through, and we all love those stories. But I think we've got to constantly look at how do we build capacity from a kid's life up. But if you hit adulthood and you haven't got education, it's tough because you develop a mindset, and how do you break out of that mindset if you don't know any different? So I think it's easy to say, they're not helping themselves, but you've never been educated, they don't know how to. And so that's where we start with English, and then we do what we can to actually help them get into the next phase. So, there's again, through the church, there's quite a few employers, some that don't require education, that we'll start them in. And once they get a sniff of, this is a better life, we can push them towards education. Education's a poison chalice, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is sometimes I look at my life and I'm educated, but my lack of education actually helps me sometimes to not think through too hard to actually do something. Whereas when you're overeducated, you actually see all the perils and you never start anything. So
become too analytical.
Yeah, there's a dance between how you do that.
What's your future? What's your vision for Empower in the future?
Well, to hang on to the tail of the cat that's dragging us along. No, not really. I think for us, we've got to constantly never get caught in that we are a food relief centre or we are a needs-based organisation. So what is the greatest need in society? It just happens to be that food insecurity is a massive need right now, and it's changed from COVID, and we've changed effectively. So I think going forward, we've touched on it privately, but I think the other insecurity is going to be housing. We're seeing an increased. Again, we all go, people are living on the streets because they've made the wrong decisions or they've done this, that. Yeah, there's a percentage of people that have done that, but even if they have, we should still care because often it's a negative moment in their life that thrust them into that place. Maybe we can redeem them from that. But there's a genuine, I've got kids and we're doing fine financially, but just since the pandemic, the average rental price has probably gone up 30-40%. Then you put food cost on top of that. People are going to struggle to pay the bills of how to actually have a house. And then to buy a house, well, that's a whole nother level altogether. And if you don't have mum and dad to help you with the deposit, or how do you actually step into that place? And so I think if you project that out, that's going to become a big issue. And we got to get smart about it. Again, I don't think we should give people things. We should give people a pathway of how to get there. And I think the starting point is going to become a big issue. And how do we actually collectively work on that? On top of that, the family crisis, I don't think we talk about it much. But when I grew up, so whatever your persuasion is relating to what a family nucleus looks like, mum and dad, dad and dad, I don't think we need to get into that. But we do need to get into 50% of our population is single parent now. So just not having two incomes in a home creates all sorts of tension points. And we need to consider how that looks going forward. How do we help single parents? In the church environment, for example, we did a special offering and we took $100,000. So every single parent in the church gets a credit card for $500 just for Christmas. This year, if they don't have that, how are they going to have a half reasonable Christmas with their 2-3 kids as a single parent? I think we have to ask ourselves the question about the whole single parent thing. And some are self-sufficient and that's fine, but we've got to create nets for those that aren't, because that wasn't there when I was a kid. 10% of my friends were in a single parent environment. Today, 50-60% are in that. And that just the demographics of having that split. And then the challenges that come with all of that sort of stuff as well. But for us, we don't have this is what we're going to do. We're just going to keep monitoring with society and see what the need is and meet the need and keep making it up as we go along.
So I guess for me, I've had the benefit of coming here previously and seeing a bit of what you do and meeting some of your staff, and today meeting you and having a chat with you. And you are obviously an incredible leader, and that shows by the work that this organisation does. What's your average day look like for Neil Smith?
I travel about 30 weeks a year, so I'm not in the country about 30 weeks a year. I'm not as busy as people would think I am. And I say that intentionally because I think we have a bit of a pride in our society of how busy you are. Oh, I'm so busy. Oh, I've got so much on. I don't take something on unless I'm confident that there's great people around me. So my strength in leadership is not me. It's my ability to see other great people. And I think for me, that means whenever I am around, particularly in Melbourne, I'm spending time with people. 8 o'clock this morning, had breakfast with one of my staff members all day. When I'm around, that's what I do. Because I think our greatest capital is humanity, is people. And so if I can divest who I am in 5 key people in Empower and 5 key people in what I do in my international division, and probably my international division, there's more like 25 people. But if I can put energy and time into them and confidence, then I can stand back and just crisis management rather than, because they've got great capacity, and where they have a weakness, I can be the strength. So for me, this phase of my life, look, I have this sort of adage that legacy is not what you leave for people, it's what you leave in people. And I think what we tend to do is legacy is what we build so we can hand it to somebody. But if I hand my son $1 million and I haven't taught him how to hold it, he can burn it a week later, and what was the point of that? So better for me to give him 100,000, but he knows what to do with it, than give him $1 million. And that's my adage. But for that to happen, you have to step back. And I think the critical thing for me is legacy is trusting and believing in other people and trusting that they're going to make mistakes, but your job is to help them through the mistake rather than developing them so well that they never make a mistake. Well, it's just unrealistic they're going to.
What do you want legacy to be?
Well, I think the greatest form of legacy is it goes on beyond you. When you're not there, it continues. It's not so much about program, it's what people actually going on themselves. So with my son and my daughter, I want them to get the maximum out of life and feel like they're living as they were purposed to live, not just have the maximum. Because the more we have, the more we have to look after, and the more probably stressed we become, So in a materialistic environment like we live in, we're all consumed with what we've got or getting, and then when we've got it, we've got to look after it. And that becomes a bigger issue than trying to get it. So if we could have a bit less and divest more in people, I think for me, that's my legacy, that it wasn't all around me. It was around us and what we could achieve together.
You wrote a novel, Think Like a King.
Yeah.
It was released last year. How did that come about?
Look, I speak on the road. I've just come back literally yesterday I've been in Singapore and Greece, England and South Africa in the last 14 days, and I've spoken 25 times. So I speak to leaders in various forms all around the world. And I realised that most people still live with massive insecurities. And most of it's based around their lack of identity, whether it be from parenting, school, circumstance of life. So Think Like a King is the reason I came up with that title is because most people, a king, you think about King Charles now, but he was born many years ago and there was never any doubt that he was going to be the king. So really the day he's born, he is the king. He's just a king in waiting. But he wasn't ever asking the question, will this be mine one day? Whereas in the materialistic environment we live in, people are living all the time with, what can I get? How can I get it? Go to this self-help seminar. I'm not against any of that, but I'm just saying we get so consumed with that when you look back at yourself, you go, I'm an insecure person. I don't know who I am, what I'm trying to be. Whereas a king knows that they own it all. So then in waiting, all you're doing is getting ready to one day when you own it, you know what to do with it. And at the right time, it's yours. Whereas most of us are believing we're going to be something, but in the back of our mind going, I don't know if I'll ever make it. And the older we get, the more we feel like we've missed it. So we live with all these insecurities. And so Think Like a King, the 2nd, 3rd and 4th chapter is basically be, think, do. And on the road, I've been speaking this for 10, 12 years, so I thought I should actually put it in a book. And the be, think, do is your being, which part in my case is a faith-based, I know who I am and what I'm purposed to do, causes me to think a certain way. And my thinking fashions what I do. But we live in society where from a young age we're educated And then we spend most of our life unraveling what we've been educated. Because I don't agree with that, I don't agree with that. And in fact, we're in a generation where we've never seen so many people in their 30s and 40s retooling to do something entirely different from what they've done their whole life to become, because they suddenly realise this is not what I want to do with my life. And so if we could actually get to the point, particularly with young people, and that's why I love young people, we could actually fashion who they are and what they believe, then their thinking will change, and then the sky's the limit. They'll do what they're purposed to do. But most of us find ourselves in a job and then go, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life, and how do I unravel that? And that's really what the book's about. And then it just talks about team, but not team from the perspective that we often talk about. It's team, who have you got around you? And team isn't the people you employ for a business person. It's what voices are in your head. Do you have a correct mentor? Do you have a correct person who gives you the analytics of how you run your business? And so build the right people around you to achieve the right objective. And so the book is, again, it's a bit like my life, really. It's a collective. It's got QR codes all through the book, and I've got small videos that we've made actually right here in this room. And you scan it with your phone, which was the great thing of COVID, because I wanted the book not to be a read and you go, oh, that's a good book. I wanted it to be, how do I build in a moment into the book? So every chapter, I've got a business person. I've got the founder, and who's somebody I've been mentoring for years, but is Jahing Chan. He's the founder of Bueller International, which is a big property development company here in Melbourne. He's on there speaking about what it is to partner with another organisation. And then I've got Craig Hughes, who's a Qantas pilot, captain of Qantas pilot. I've got, you probably know Nathan Brown. He was a footballer for his wife, started up a perfumery, and it's the biggest perfumery country in Australia. And she talks about teamwork and how do you get the right people around you and people like that. And so now you read the book, but you scan a code, and for 3-4 minutes, these guys will talk about the summary of the chapter. And that for me is important, because it's not just Neil Smith writing a book. It's actually a collective of people that are actually communicating to you. And then the last chapter is legacy, which I just touched on. And that's my passion at this stage of my life. I feel like the next 15 years is how do I divest in other people? So
most importantly, for the people that have either read the book or have been involved with Empower and know what you do, and those that don't, that listen to the podcast and research and work out what you do, what's the most important way they can get involved, and how can they help?
Yeah, good question. From our perspective, there's obviously volunteering opportunities at various levels based on connectivity to people that you're involved in. There's obviously financial contribution that people can make, which they can go to the Empower Australia website, and it's all listed. In fact, probably the best way to find out all the ways you can get involved is via the Empower Australia website, and then you can read it for yourself and see it.
What's the website?
empoweraustralia.com.au, yeah. And then you can go on there and you can see it all. But then the other thing is, been a lot of conversation, and I'm still working through how we do this, but been a lot of conversation about giving, so that you should live on 80%, you should give away 10%, you should save 10%. All the investors say that's what you should do. Why don't you think about that with your life? With privilege, I said it before, comes responsibility. I live a privileged life. So in part, I give to Empower. When I was asked, well, I wasn't asked, but when I was more intentionally got involved, there's a part of me that says, Neil, you've got so many good things in your life. You need to give back somewhere. And so a part of my life needs to be given away. And there's a passage of scripture in the Bible that says, freely you have received, so freely you should give. Every football club, if you're a great footballer and it gives you a lifestyle, all the footballers would say, we've got to give back to the club. Well, I think we've got to do that with life. And so whether it be Empower Australia or another charitable organisation, don't give to relieve guilt. Giving finance is easy because you give it and then you never think about it again. But if you give of yourself, there's going to be side benefits that are far greater than just helping another person. It's going to help you to recognise there's a lot more to life than just yourself. And there's days where I think, why the heck am I doing this? But I need to have those days to remember that it's not all about me. And I think that's the most important thing. We will continue to grow and develop. I believe that with all my heart. So we don't need somebody to do something for our sake, but we do need them to do it for their sake. And then generosity is giving more than was expected without any guarantee of reward. So don't give for what you get back. That's how our society trades now. Just give. And it will come back in various ways, but just give of your life, give of your time, give of your money, and position yourself in that way, and you'll have a great life. I could have earned a lot more money in my life in the building industry, but man, the life that I've had is way beyond what I could have done in my own right if I hadn't given a piece of who I am away. And it's come back far greater than what I've ever given, so continue to do so.
You're an incredible man, and I'm extremely grateful for your time today. Thank you for giving me your time. Lovely to meet you. Thanks, mate.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Glenn.
A huge thank you to Neil Smith for being so generous with his story. His passionate dedication to helping those in need and for leading and motivating others to join the cause is awe-inspiring. His selfless energy, drive and determination is a source of inspiration for all of us. To learn more about how you can get involved and support the philanthropic endeavours of Empower, check out our show notes for more details.
To learn more about the art of giving back in whatever way you can, visit our website andrewpurdy.com.au and follow us on Instagram, The Hidden Philanthropist. Thank you for listening to the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation.